at the moment, and actually that's where I live. Just looking at the map where you are, Gary, I realized that's pretty close to Indiana, where I actually spent 3 years in my early 20s. So I'm very pleased to be traveling back there virtually.
Where in Indiana?
I was in South Bend.
Fantastic.
For 3 years, yeah.
So I went to school at IU, and I was in a rock band, and we played South Bend. So we can talk later.
Awesome, fantastic. Cool. So let's talk about today's topic. Let me just switch over here. So just who am I? Mathias Thierbach. Name is German. I'm from Germany originally. I'm head of finance systems in London, working for YouGov, where I'm running a data management and analytics team. Prior to that, I've worked as a software engineer and software architect for almost 2 decades, almost exclusively with Microsoft technologies. Yeah, so I've got a pretty techie background, and having moved into the Microsoft BI sphere about 6 years ago was a very interesting way of sort of advancing my career, because in BI, I find you actually have a very interesting intersection of technology on the one hand and business on the other hand, and bridging those gaps is something I'm particularly enjoying nowadays. The other thing I do and have done for a while is work on PBI tools, which is an open source tool filling a lot of gaps in the Microsoft ecosystem around source control and automation and DevOps, as you mentioned before. So the talk today has very much to do with all my work around DevOps and PBI tools. Basically, we're going to look at the Power BI REST API. I'm not assuming that everyone is overly familiar with it, so I'm going to introduce what is it. I'm going to do a little bit of a 101 on HTTP. I'm going to introduce the REST client extension for VS Code, which is a very, very useful client tool. We're going to have to speak about authentication. I think, Gary, you also mentioned that as one of your pain points earlier. That can be a pretty substantial stumbling block. So I'll talk about that. And then I want to spend most of the time actually going through some hopefully interesting use cases, provisioning new workspaces, cloning reports, looking at report metadata, and I caught this downloading a non-downloadable report, which I guess some of you might recognize because we've tweeted about that. So yeah, that's the idea here. It's mostly going to be demos and hands-on. I'm very keen for this session to be interactive. If you're keen, so if there are questions, don't hold back. Let us know, and I'm hoping that I can basically go through the demos, and then we can sort of move to a Q&A format if that's okay. All right, let me switch screens.
I'm loving the agenda, Matthias.
Good.
Good. Yeah.
I'm just realizing I've got way too many windows open. So here we go. So this is Microsoft's landing page, providing all the official docs about the REST APIs. And they're pretty much explaining it very nicely. So those are APIs which you can use to manage content, perform admin operations, also embed content. I'm not going to be talking about embedding very much, or not at all, unless there's a question. But basically, the REST APIs effectively give you direct access to the Power BI backend, right? And they enable you to automate stuff around Power BI. And automation, that's the sort of stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning, right? This is what my real passion is. This is where PBI Tools is coming from. Anything you can automate, move to a server, don't have to sit there clicking your mouse. That's my sort of stuff. So you can imagine I've been actually using those APIs for quite a while, so I'm hoping to sort of pass on a little bit of wisdom here, if that's okay. Now you can see over here there is a very long list of keywords: admin, apps, data flows, data sets, goals, reports. Hopefully those are all concepts familiar to you. It's basically how the API is structured. If we're looking at reports as an example, and we expand here, we can see the various API endpoints which allow you to perform certain actions. So as an example, clicking on get report in group, we get to a dedicated page which gives us a HTTP endpoint allowing us to retrieve metadata about a particular report in a particular group. And that's pretty much what every single endpoint looks like. Let's explore how we interact with them, and also let's figure out how to let's figure out this particular syntax here. Let me switch into VS Code just to there we go. Right. First of all, I mean, in fact, one of the reasons why we even set this up was Reed Havens and I recorded a tutorial a month ago, which went online last week, where we've basically presented a lot of the material I'm also going to be covering today. That is available on YouTube, and also all the code and documentation I created for that tutorial is available, and I'll share links to that afterwards. What I've done is I've basically opened the exact same project which Reed and I created back then, and I'm building on top of that. We introduced VS Code as a client to interact with the REST API. So let me show you literally from scratch what that looks like. So if I create a new file in here, I can select a language. So I'm going for HTTP, which means now I'm actually getting IntelliSense, and I'm getting all sorts of helpers and goodiness to do things here. So if I then go back to the docs, and if I say I want to see which groups I've got access to. Groups is actually an interesting term. What that really means is workspaces. Groups is sort of, that's a term from the very early days of Power BI. Unfortunately, because it would be a breaking change, the API has never changed. So whenever we're talking about groups here, it actually means workspace. So that would be one takeaway. And if I literally go take what I've got here and paste that in, you can see that VS Code actually understands that this is not just text. VS Code now understands that this actually is a request I can send. Again, the reason for that is because I selected HTTP as my language, which then enables all the goodness here. So if I click on send request, what's happening? I'm getting a response over here which says 403 forbidden. Why is that forbidden? Because the API has no idea who I am, right? So I need to authenticate. I need to provide some sort of credentials so that the API knows, first of all, which tenant I want to talk to, and secondly, what sort of permissions I've got. And that is handled using so-called bearer tokens. Basically, I need to retrieve a token, which is basically a blob of bits and bytes, which the API will be able to recognize as an official token, and something that basically represents me as a user. So one very trivial and simple way of achieving or getting to a token would be to actually go into Power BI, open DevTools, and literally look at one of the requests in here. So for instance, artifacts. You can see down here, so those are my request headers. And you can see there, oops, wrong key. That's what I wanted. There's an authorization header, which basically the Power BI UI has sent on my behalf over to the backend. And if I go in here and basically copy this guy, and go back here and say authorization bearer, and then paste. And then if I send the same thing, here we go. So now we have a different response. It's now saying 200 OK instead of 403 forbidden, right? And so that's pretty much how HTTP works. It's a text-based system where you specify a URL, you specify a method, you specify some headers, for instance, for authorization, and then you get some text back, which is your response. In this particular case, we can see there's some JSON down here. And because I asked for groups or workspaces, what I'm getting here is basically an array of all the various workspaces I've got access to in my tenant. Now, let's figure out what this token is actually all about. So first of all, what I've just done was really just for demo purposes, right? In practice, you would never sort of grab a token from DevTools. But this is actually more than just an arbitrary string of characters. This is actually a structured artifact which you can decode. If you go to, in fact, it's using the JWT format. And if you go to jwt.ms, which is a Microsoft tool or website, and paste in the token I've just grabbed, you can see down here under decoded token, there's all sorts of information in there, which is basically encoded. And what can we see here? So we can see, I'm always grabbing the wrong key here. So we can see audience. So AUD means audience. That URL, analysis.windows.net, that represents the Power BI REST API. So basically the token says that it was issued in order to be used with the Power BI API. We can also see we've got issuer here. So that is the authority which generated the token for me. In this case, it's Azure AD. And we can see other things like down here, my name, my email address and whatnot. So there we go. That's actually what a bearer token is. I thought it would be quite useful actually making you aware of that, because oftentimes we sort of consider these things a black box, and then we really struggle when stuff doesn't work and we don't fully understand what's behind it. Now, was there anything? Oh, yes. What's also interesting, so this is something I wanted to point out. IAT, that means issued at. So this long number is actually a timestamp. In fact, it's a Unix timestamp. If I grab this and copy that, and I go to timestampconverter.com and paste it in here, I can see, here we go. It's now converted that into a real timestamp, which is basically 10th of May, 4:49. That's UTC, and it's 5:49, which is basically my local time right now. So that's that. We can see that my browser basically had been holding on to the token for half an hour or so, but that's okay, because if we look at EXP, that's the expiration. If I grab that one and paste it in here, we can see it won't expire until 7:23 for me, which is basically in an hour. So by default, those tokens have a lifetime of 60 minutes. Once you retrieve them, you can do anything you want within 60 minutes. And you don't have to worry about getting a new token in the meantime. But after those 60 minutes, the token will no longer be good. And then you have to figure out how to refresh it or how to get a new one. All right, so we've sorted that. And if we go back here, as I said before, obviously it's not practical at all for us to somehow find this token and paste it in here. And this is actually where the beauty of this extension comes in, because it has built-in support for Azure AD. The extension will actually retrieve the token on my behalf and will do all of that completely automated. So what I want to do instead of this, here we go. I want to put something else in here as my authorization header, and this is the stuff I Reed and I have talked about at length. So this is all already recorded and documented. So I'm just gonna go to one of the files which are already available. I'm gonna grab this and I'm gonna basically put that in here. Like so. And you can see there's now a particular syntax. The extension always uses double curly braces for macros and variables. So this one is called AAD v2 token. And we're specifying, so this should look familiar now, actually. That's precisely why I was pointing out the audience in my bearer token earlier, because this is precisely what we're specifying here. So we're basically saying we need a token from AAD that's valid for Power BI, for the Power BI REST API, which means we need to specify that exact same URL as our scope here. And then we're also referencing a client ID. So that one is basically an Azure AD application, which we're going to authenticate against. I'm doing a bit of a hacky thing here. I'm basically using a Microsoft application, which Power BI Desktop also happens to be using. Again, in the recording, we do talk about that. This is definitely not recommended for production use, right? This is great if you just want to do some quick and throwaway requests. If you're not in a position where you can actually create your own Azure AD application, because that generally requires tenant admin permissions, which most people would struggle to get to. So for those sort of scenarios where you basically just want to make a few calls to either do some prototyping or just figure out some information about your tenant, this is absolutely perfect, because you have no setup to do. That works for any user. There's no security problem here, by the way, right? So the application is just an artifact I log into against, but it would still use just my user permissions in order to access my tenant. So when I click on send request now, something different will happen. Now I need to log in to Azure AD, and I need to provide, I need to select which credentials I want to work with, and I need to obviously provide my password. In order to do that securely, I'm going to get redirected to my browser. So if I basically click sign in here, I'm going to have a new browser window open up, which is now for me on a different monitor. Sorry, I just need to find my mouse. Oh, here. So I'm just going to pull that across so we can all see what's happening. Right, so I've got this now. It's asking me to enter the code, which I can simply Control V because it's in the clipboard for me. I go next, and then I've got my standard Azure AD login. So I'm going to click on my PBI Tools user, and I'm going to confirm that I'm happy to sign into Power BI Desktop. Again, right, this is because we're sort of using a hack here. We're using the Power BI Desktop client ID. Now coming back here, when I click done, it's worked. The request was sent, and I'm actually getting my response back here. And the cool thing that's happening now is that access token is now cached internally inside VS Code, which means if I now make subsequent requests and I go really wild here, I no longer have to go through the login dance. That is only needed once, right in the beginning, and beyond that, it's I'm just getting the advantage of having the cache token sent for me. Yeah, that's pretty much the basics in terms of what does the VS Code extension look like? How do I authenticate interactively? Let me just switch back to my slides.
This might be, Matthias, this might be a good point to take a few questions.
Sure, if there are any, by all means.
So Imran is asking, one of my challenges has been that the O365 tenant admin credentials are not commonly shared with the PBI developers. Are there any workarounds or recommended paths? I'm assuming he's wanting to access during the development stage some of those admin level API calls. Do you have any? One response was from James Holly. Khan, if I understand you correctly, I managed to sell the service principal with appropriate rights approach as a workaround to getting global tenant admin rights, which I really didn't want. Do you have any? Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, allow me to actually move to the slide I was going to present, because I think that answers some of the questions for us very nicely. And then I'll come back to that in that context, if that's okay. So you should be able to see the matrix I've created on that slide. that's something which is quite important for us to get our head around. So basically, looking at columns, we've got two different ways of authenticating. One is interactive, the other one is using service principal. And there are different pros and cons. And then looking at the rows, we've got two different scopes, if you will, in terms of what permissions each of those authentication options actually gives us. So basically, when it comes to the API, there are four different quadrants which we can opt for, and some of them allow certain things, some allow others. So let me, so coming back to the question here in terms of admin access, bottom row. So admin access basically means tenant admin, right? Being able to see everything that's happening in my Power BI tenant and possibly even be able to make modifications there. There are two different ways of getting admin access. Using interactive login, so basically with a user providing their login, I can get full read-write access at the tenant level as long as that user has the Power BI admin or even the Office 365 admin role. So that's a prerequisite for that. Given that the question was about challenges with Office 365 tenant admins, what I would recommend here is to use the Power BI admin role. It still has to be granted at the tenant level, but it should make your Office 365 admins much more relaxed, because that one only provides permission for Power BI and nothing else. I mean, honestly, without that kind of access, you're just not going to be able to perform any admin operations. The slightly, so just to clarify what I'm talking about here, so that's basically this one down here. So if we move to the right, the service principal route, we can also get admin access using a service principal, which is particularly interesting because that means you can fully automate stuff. There's no interactivity needed. However, that's only possible for read-only scenarios. So you can basically only read information, you can't modify anything. That's mostly interesting in terms of using the scanner APIs, for instance, or audit logs, but otherwise not going to be very useful if you actually want to create or modify stuff. At the workspace level, so basically we don't want to have full tenant admin access. For the workspace level, we have two options which are basically equivalent. So we can either use interactive login with a particular user, or we can use a service principal. The prerequisite for both of them is that that particular principal, so either the user or the service account, has been granted workspace access. And that can, well, that usually has to be done explicitly. Not sure if that helps, but because since we're talking about security features here, there are definitely no hacks or workarounds possible. Any other questions?
So just to follow up, Imran, are you needing to write, or are you just needing to read? Imran, I think we might have lost Imran.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry.
So, yeah.
Cool. So let me go back to the demo, and let's look at the service principal route. So what I've already shown was interactive, right? And we've seen that requires at least as a one-off to do the, people normally call it the login dance, because you sort of have to go into the browser temporarily. As you can imagine, that's not great when it comes to automation, right? Because you would always have to start off with someone sitting there clicking the buttons. So what I'm actually much more interested in and excited about is using service principles, where you end up having fully automated scenarios. The VS Code extension, I've got to be very careful here because I don't want to leak any secrets. So the VS Code extension supports service principles by allowing you to actually specify the credentials for those in your settings file. Again, that's also covered in the tutorial that's already recorded. And what you can see here, I'm basically using the environment variables setting, and I've got 1, 2, 3 entries here, as well as a shared section. For each of the 3 entries down here, which are so-called environments, I've got client ID and client secret. So that's basically username and password, if you will, for service principal. With those configured, I can use another really cool feature for REST for the REST client, which is showing. I'm always here we go. Which is showing down here, where basically I can toggle between different environments. In this particular case, I can toggle between different service principles. Moving on to the extensive demo I wanted to walk you through, which is basically all of this here. Let me just cover one thing prior to that, which is we can use variables. So for instance, this piece here is always going to be exactly the same for every single call we'll want to make. I can basically, just using good old developer practices, I can define a variable. I can call that base, for instance, and just paste this string in there. And then I can go down here, and you see there's a very, very nice IntelliSense in place. If I type base, it's going to come up as a virtual dropdown, if you will. If I now click my tab key, it automatically creates the variable replacement syntax for me. And it goes even further. Hovering over that, you can see what's in that variable. So that's a very neat way of simplifying stuff. And that's actually something I've used extensively over here. So we can make a little more space here. So I wanted to walk you through a extensive automation scenario, which from my point of view is quite realistic, and basically use that to point out, first of all, what's possible using the APIs, and secondly, how to interact with the VS Code extension. What I'm doing now is I'm using service principles. And as you can see, the authorization header with a service principle is much simpler. I'm basically saying app only, and the extension knows which credentials to use because I've got them selected here. So I'm using the PBI demo service principle right now. Let me just give that another name. Number 1, I'm creating a new workspace. That is also quite interesting, because if you use a service principal to create a workspace, the service principal will automatically become a workspace admin, which means it has full capabilities and full access to anything in that workspace. So this is a very, very nice starting point. If I click here to send request, you can see that, how long did that take? Do you have any timings here? 190 milliseconds, right? So that's pretty impressive. If you ever let me just go back here once. If you ever used an option which was once available in the documentation, the so-called try it option, that's actually disappeared a few weeks ago. One of the main reasons why I'm pushing the VS Code alternative now. But if you ever use the try it option, which was basically a way of invoking those same endpoints directly from the documentation, it was anything but fast. It took a very long time. I really appreciated the convenience of just being able to click there, but the practice of it was quite annoying. Whereas, as we've just seen, this one is a very different experience. So I've now created a new workspace. It has this ID generated. And one very nice thing I can also do, I not only can I create variables with static content, I can also create variables with dynamic content, where I'm actually accessing the response coming from a particular request. So if you're looking here, create workspace is a name I've given to this post request. And now I'm saying, from that request, take the response, go into the body and grab me ID and put that into this particular variable. Hovering over workspace ID, I can see 34F6, which is precisely what was returned here. So this way I can basically pass values from one call to another in a very nice way. The next thing I want to do, I actually want to assign this new workspace to a PPU capacity, just to sort of show that that's also possible. The interesting thing here is, and it took me a while to figure that out because it's not documented anywhere, service principals cannot be assigned they cannot be assigned a PPU license. So generally, in order to assign a workspace to a capacity, you have to be an admin on that capacity. That's definitely not possible for PPU in conjunction with a service principal. The nice thing is it's not necessary. So I can assign this to a PPU, even though technically that service principal has no access to the capacity at all. So if I go next, here we go. This looks a bit weird because nothing came back. However, what we need to look at is the very first line. What we need to look at is the response. 200, okay. That means success, right? So in the HTTP world, it means everything worked fine and we've got what we wanted. Just for whatever reason, there is nothing else we're getting here. We can also look at what is my assignment status, right? So particularly when a workspace has a lot of content in, moving it to a different capacity might actually take some time. So you want to make sure you check whether or not the assignment has succeeded, and we can see that here, completed successfully. Because it's an empty workspace, it basically works instantly. So what do I have now? I've got a workspace called demo workspace 2. It's part of my PPU capacity. However, I have no way of accessing that because the only member on that workspace currently is that service principal, which I can't log in as. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a member to that new workspace. In fact, I'm going to add the login I'm generally using for that tenant. And as we can see, 280 milliseconds, no response here, but same thing as before, we're getting a 200 OK. So that means as logging in as this particular user, I can now go into Power BI. I can close my dev tools. So I'm logged in as Mathias at pbitools.org. I just need to refresh because new workspaces don't show up automatically. You always have to refresh. And so if I now look for demo workspace 2, there we go. That's it. So 34F6, that's the one which was just created. We can see it's premium per user. If I go to access, we can see I'm a member and the service principal is an admin. So things are becoming things are happening now. The next thing I want to do is I want to, and this is actually a very nice example for the API because that's something you cannot do in any other way. The API allows me to clone existing reports which are in my tenant, either under a new name into the same workspace or into a different workspace. And so I've got this report sitting in this particular workspace, and I'm going to clone it into my new workspace, which I just created. In order to do that, I'm basically posting using /clone, and I'm specifying what the name should be and what my target workspace is. And you can see the REST client extension is smart enough to allow me to do variable replacement even within a request body like this. So if I send this, again, 240 milliseconds, so pretty impressive. I've now got, or I'm now expecting to see a new report in the workspace which didn't exist just a few minutes ago. So if I go in here and refresh, there we go. That's my report, report cloned. And if I look at the lineage view, I can see the data set for the report is in a different workspace. It's in the datasets workspace. And I've got access to it because I'm a member at the workspace level. So nothing else needs to be shared with me. Let's do some more interesting stuff. So first of all, because this created a new report in the tenant, I need to extract the report ID if I then want to do some more stuff with it. And I'm doing this in the exact same way as before. The new report ID comes through here, so I can access it using the alias I've given to my query, and then .response.body.id, which means report ID now has 97297, which is pretty much what I've got here. I can also use the API to actually get some metadata.
Mathias,
yes.
one quick question.
Sure.
From, I think we had a hand raised, Fernando, but it appears his hand is down now. Fernando, you still have a question?
I just posted it.
You're saying you can copy a report to another workspace using the UI?
Yes.
Really? I had no idea that was possible. How do you do that? So let's go to the report.
If you go to the workspace.
Yeah.
And then there.
You can save a copy.
And then you choose the other.
Oh, I see. All right. Has that always been there? Or is that a recent addition?
No, it's not recent. I've used it more than 1 year.
Okay. Well, apologies. I had no idea.
No, now you owe me a beer.
Perfect. However, I am going to show you another report-related call, which is definitely not possible using the UI. So just be slightly patient with me. So I've got this guy now. Yep. So one other thing I can do, and again, that is not possible using the UI. I'm absolutely certain about this. Remember when we looked at the lineage view just now, that report was linked to a data set using to a data set in a workspace called datasets, right? What I can do, and again, that's very interesting for automation scenarios because I can actually move connections between different environments if I wanted to. I can rebind that report to a different data set as long as obviously the schema is compatible. And so that's what I'm doing here. So I'm basically posting to the rebind endpoint, specifying the workspace ID and the report ID. And in my body, I'm specifying the dataset ID I want to bind to. So let's just look at what things look like to begin with. That's the report currently. It's bound to this data set, which is A4318. And now I'm saying bind it to the dataset 6A305. Send request. Same thing here. Empty body. However, I'm getting a 200 OK. So let's see if that worked. If I go back to this workspace and if I then refresh, look at that. I've got the same report, which is now linked to another data set that actually lives in a different workspace. So that's very interesting if you think about automation and DevOps and actually testing reports against different data set versions, for instance. So that's that.
Yeah, I could also see a scenario where if you were converting from direct query to import for performance reasons. Let's say you had a direct query data set and it was not performing well, and you decided to import the whole data set, then you could just repoint the report to the imported version of the data set.
Exactly, absolutely. So that's rebind. And as you can see, right, so there's a lot of stuff going on here in terms of getting the syntax right and the URL and all of that. I'm going to share this entire file via GitHub, so you can grab that as is, obviously without my service principal secrets, and you can use that as a base for your own explorations. So we've done clone report, we've done rebind report. Yeah, so everything else is basically to wind down stuff. So let's move, if that's okay, let's move to another scenario, which I'm also very excited about, which is, in fact, that actually got some traction on Twitter just over the last week or so, because James Bartlett published an article where he was taking the same approach, which I had blogged about a couple of years ago, and he converted it into a PowerShell script. So what are we talking about here? The problem is that this report, because it was not uploaded from Power BI Desktop as a PBX file. It was actually created in the service, cannot be downloaded, right? So you can see download this file, that's grayed out. And that doesn't just apply when a report gets cloned. It also applies when you create a new report like so directly in the browser, right? Those ones basically cannot be downloaded, and that can be quite problematic because you know, it does happen that people put a lot of effort into those reports, and and spend hours and then suddenly find that they're in a dead end road because they can't get it out of a service to get it back into a file. So what can we do? This is actually where the API comes in to our rescue, and where basically there's no other option available. What we can do is we can use the update report contents API. So just going back to the docs here, under reports, we've got update report content in group. And that one does something very interesting. It basically takes two reports and it literally moves the definition of all my visuals and pages from one report into another. And again, this is also very interesting for DevOps scenarios where you can could, for instance, stage something in a test workspace and then use the update report content API to move it into production. But we're going to use it in order to overcome this download limit. And I'm doing that by going into Power BI Desktop, which I thought I had. Oh, yes, sorry. I'm going into Power BI Desktop, so I've already pre-started it because it always takes a long time. So what I'm doing is I'm connecting to the same data set using a live connection, and I'm creating. Well, basically, I'm creating a thin report, but I can leave it there. I basically don't have to do anything else. I don't have to put anything in here. I basically just used it as a blank report, which I now publish into my workspace. So I'm just going to call that blank or whatever, doesn't matter. And then I'm going to put it into the same workspace we've just been working with. Here we go. Won't take very long because there's nothing in there. Cool. So just going back here, looking in my workspace and refresh. I've got two reports now. One which is blank, the other one which contains the stuff I want to rescue and actually get down to PBX file. We can also see they happen to be linked to different data sets now, but those data sets are actually clones of each other. So that's not a big deal either. But what I can do now, because the blank report was originally created in Power BI Desktop and basically uploaded using the API, using Power BI Desktop, I can download that one. And so putting those two insights together, this report is downloadable, and I can shift the contents from one report into the other. I can use that to basically update this report and then download it and have the report contents which were not downloadable earlier available to me. So let's do that. All I need to do for that is to actually grab a few IDs. So first of all, the workspace ID. I don't have that because I literally created a workspace earlier during the demo. So I'm gonna copy that from here. That's this one. The original report is the one that contains stuff, and the download report is this one, which is blank. Here we go. So the other one I need is that one. That's the one I want to get. So report ID is this. Right. And then it's literally one API call, which is this one down here, update report content. Let's just check some metadata. So the original report, it's that one here. And you can actually use the API why do I have a problem with my control key today? If you look at this property is from PBIX, which is currently set to false, that's basically the indication for you that that report can't be downloaded. If I go to the other report, the one which I uploaded explicitly, we can see that is from PBIX is true, right? So it's also a very neat way of using the API to determine whether I can download or not. The UI won't tell me other than me actually going into the report and trying to download. So all I need to do now is to basically run this update report content API. So we're referencing our workspace. We're referencing the report I ultimately want to be able to download. And then in the request body, we're specifying the original report as our source. So if I run this, there we go, 200 OK. So that just took a few milliseconds. If I now go back to my workspace and go in here, there we go. So now I've got the report that was which was cloned from another workspace earlier, and I can go and actually download it. Here we go, and I can. That was probably a mistake. And I can open it here, and I need to do that explicitly. So if I go browse report, if I go to downloads and blank, so that's the one which was just downloaded, we'll see that's a fully fledged PBIX with a live connection, and I can now continue to work on my desktop. I think that's a good point to get some other questions, if there are any.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but I'll say that's very cool as a comment.
There we go.
But maybe I wonder, is that also possible using ALM Toolkit, or is that maybe not?
No.
I don't know that you can do objects like visuals and things in ALM Toolkit.
No. Both ALM Toolkit and Tabular Editor only work with data sets and models. They don't do anything for reports.
Very good.
That's where PBI Tools is coming in, by the way. But
go ahead. Go ahead. Plug it.
That's a different talk. Yeah, so there we go. This is open now. It's a live connection, and again, James tweeted about it, and he provided basically a PowerShell script to achieve exactly the same thing. But at the end of the day, that one is only using the exact same REST API. So that's also what I would want to see as a takeaway here, and why it's useful looking into the REST API and getting familiar with it, because that is basically as close as you can get to the backend, right? All other tooling is ultimately just using the REST API to provide their functionality. But the REST API itself is where you get straight to the sources, if you will. It also means that any new features which are made available using the API are accessible to you first using the API directly before any other tooling will be able to catch up. So definitely a good point to keep in mind. Yeah, I'm pretty flexible now. There's definitely a lot more we can say around the different authentication options. We could look into the admin endpoints and see what the two different versions are in terms of read-write and read-only. I'm more than happy to get some direction here in terms of what people are interested in.
We have a comment And
Yeah.
now some questions coming in, if you want to take them.
Right. Okay, cool. James, can we deploy themes via API? Yes and no. So this API will not allow you to do anything with respect to themes. However, and obviously I know you're a PBI Tools fan, with PBI Tools you could, because themes are basically embedded into reports, and as some of you may know, that's basically what PBI Tools gives you access to, allowing to automate modifications and changes to reports and then ultimately deploying them automatically, unless I'm missing something here, unless there is some sort of theme option available anywhere else. Okay. The other question was, what would be a good place to store those commands? So let me just show you the sources already available for your reference. So on GitHub, under my own repo, we've got this guy from a week ago, which is basically the same project I was just working in, and which is also provided sort of as additional resources for the YouTube tutorial. And you can go in here in order to see some example requests using the correct syntax and everything, also using the correct authorization header. So that is one place where you can basically grab some working examples. And why am I pointing that out? Because I think if you ended up creating your own repository of frequently used requests, then I personally would put those into a repository and use that for internal purposes, right? So just going back here, we basically have a bunch of files, as long as they've got the .http extension. Just gonna close all of this here. As long as they have the HTTP extension, they're going to be recognized by VS Code, provided, and that's really important, I should probably have mentioned that earlier, provided you've got the extension installed, right? So basically, if you don't have it installed, and you certainly wouldn't automatically, go to extensions and look for REST client, and then basically find this one and just click install, and that will enable everything we've just seen. Newbie question: can you use the Power BI API to go to an external source, grab data, and then load the data into a PBX file? Actually, Marco and SQL BI actually, okay, so it's probably not what you have in mind here, but I'm going to mention it anyways. So basically, there is a concept called push data sets, which is something not very widely used and not very widely known, but just taking your question literally, this is precisely what the push dataset API does. It allows you, as you can see, to basically post data, to post rows of data into a dataset remotely. Then any report you've got linked to the dataset will basically automatically get those updates. Let me see. SQL BI, gosh, data push. What's it called? Push, there we go, push data set. So SQL BI actually provided a tool precisely real time using push here, precisely using those API endpoints. And they made PBI push tools available as a command line tool and PBI push tools as a PowerShell commandlet. So admittedly, that's a bit of a niche, and it basically only works when you have a relatively simple a data model, but there are certainly some use cases for that. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. For anything else, you probably want to look into direct query and basically push data at the source rather than directly into Power BI. Okay, Fernando just typing. Cool. All right. Thanks very much. Any other questions? Anyone interested in more details around authentication?
Yes, if you can share,
covered it
please.
Oh, go ahead, Fernando.
Oh, yes, interested.
Okay. So if I go back to the matrix here. So remember, we basically have 4 different options: admin level access, workspace level access, and service principal and interactive. So I've got a few examples. Here, create workspace. I've got a few examples prepared here. So first of all, let's take a look at what an admin endpoint is and what we can actually do as an admin going beyond what a workspace level user can do. So there's one example here. If I send this, not good, yeah, good. That's a good reminder as well. So first of all admin API endpoints are very easy to identify because they all start with /admin, and then everything else comes after. In the documentation, just going back here, they are actually all mentioned right at the top in a dedicated section. So it's a very, very neat way of identifying them. It's not, admittedly, it's not very easy to read, but at some point you definitely get the gist of it. So one example would be, and that's one which I find very useful, is actually to be able to get very comprehensive information about workspaces, which you can only retrieve as an admin. That one is using the expand query parameter, which allows us to fetch metadata about a particular workspace, which also includes all underlying reports, users, and data sets. Now, why did this fail for me? And I think it's a good example to point this out. Remember what I said in the beginning, talking about environments, and when I pointed out that I basically specify the service principal I'm working with down here. Now, this service principal is not an admin service principal. It's a workspace level service principal. So what I need to do, I need to switch over to another service principal, which I call the read-only admin one. If I then make the same request, I'm actually getting some stuff back. And this is a very comprehensive view of everything I might want to know about a workspace. So not only do I have my workspace ID and the capacity ID and the name, I also have all reports in that workspace. I've got all users. And I think I can expand this even further to contain data flows and dashboards as well. So that's precisely what an admin user needs to see. This particular endpoint, because it doesn't modify any data, it only requires a read-only admin access. And this is hopefully where I can bring things back together. If we only need read-only access as an administrator and as someone who is interested in automation, we can actually use the service principal authentication. We don't have to use the interactive authentication that requires a Power BI admin user. So that's why I'm a big fan of this, because it's perfectly available for automation scenarios. The one important point, I'm just switching to a different browser window now. The one important point we need to be aware of. So I'm in my admin portal here, my Power BI tenant admin portal, and it's this particular setting which we need to enable in order to be able to use service principals for read-only admin endpoints. Again, you will have to make friends with your Power BI administrator in order to get this enabled. But once it's there, you're good to go. Best practice is that you don't apply this to the entire organization, but instead just use specific security groups. So I've got an Azure AD group called Power BI Read-Only API Principles. And so any principal that's a member of that group has those permissions and is able to use the read-only admin APIs. That's it. There's literally a one-off setup. And then you're good to go, and you can basically use this one, you can use that one and this one. So here we've got data sets. If I make that request, I'm now getting a listing of all data sets across my entire tenant. And again, I didn't need to be a tenant administrator. I just needed to have a service principal put in place with those permissions. So you can see there's a lot of information I'm getting here. And the same thing applies to capacities. Here we go. I've got two capacities in my tenant. There's a suspended A1 and then there's an active PPU. Hopefully that was useful. There's another question. Okay, so when I started doing my how can I let me close all. Here we go. I just need here. There we go. I think that was it. Yes. So that's the first file I started with. The question was, why did I choose HTTP as a language, and could I have chosen another language? No, I needed to choose HTTP because that is basically what enables the REST client extension, which is what's giving me this little hyperlink here, which is giving me the AAD v2 token macro, and which is giving me all the goodness we've just seen in terms of sending those requests and being able to see the responses very nicely. However, the extension itself actually has a lot of features built into which I didn't even get to. So I would absolutely recommend having a read through this and giving lots of kudos to the creator of the extension. I'm a huge fan, as you can tell. For instance, if anyone's familiar with curl, basically the almost default Unix client for HTTP requests, you can actually paste curl commands into the editor, and you can also do the reverse. You can copy a HTTP request as a curl command to actually then use in your Unix shell. So that's supported. GraphQL supported. Different authentication options. So obviously we've only looked at Azure AD here. What else comes to mind? Yeah, so would definitely recommend having a look through the docs here. Cool, yeah, good thumbs up from Fernando. Thanks very much. If we just go back to the docs once more. Right, so which endpoints are not read-only? I think that might be quite useful to talk about as well. So basically, anything which starts with get. So get, you've probably gathered already, is a very common term in the HTTP world. Get basically generally indicates that you just want to retrieve some information and you're not expecting to modify anything. So anything under this admin heading which doesn't say get, so for instance here, this one has add, and it's a post request. This one is assign, and it's also a post request. This one is unassign. This one is export. Actually, this one is also get. Then we have delete, right? So that's using delete as a verb. So any of those admin on endpoints, they will only work with an interactive login. They will only work with a user who has Power BI admin or tenant admin permissions. Anything else with a get method will work with a service principal as long as the service principal is authorized for the read-only endpoints. Yeah, that's not quite obvious, I would say, because obviously here everything shows up under admin, but actually the distinction between those two ways of accessing the API is pretty significant. So absolutely something to keep in mind. A final point I should make. So obviously I was cheating a little bit right in the beginning when I was basically using Microsoft's client ID here, right? So if you want to go into production and if you can't use a service principal for whatever reason, so basically if you want to go into production and you require interactive authentication, you should set up your own AAD application. I've got an example here that's also covered in the tutorial. So you can see there's a different client ID here, and that one is, let me find, here we go. If I go to my, if you go into my tenant and go to app registrations, this is the one we've got in here. So basically, that is where I've got my client ID, which I can copy from here, and where I don't need to specify any certificates or secrets. In fact, all I need to specify here are API permissions. So that's something we haven't covered earlier. So basically, if you don't use the hack and use Microsoft's client ID, which is basically pre-authorized with all permissions possible, you have to think about that your application basically needs to specify what permissions are ultimately available in terms of accessing Power BI. So if I go to Power BI Service and go to Delegated, there are lots of possibilities here which you can choose. And once a user has logged in, basically the intersection between the user access as well as the permissions granted here will be in effect, right? So basically, as an example, if you specify report.read all instead of report read write all, and the user tries to use this application to modify a report, it would still fail even if the user has those permissions because the application doesn't actually have sufficient permissions itself. Hopefully I didn't confuse things too much here, but that's something which is important to keep in mind. Also, some of those permissions are so extensive that a administrator basically has to provide admin consent for those. Otherwise, you can apply them to your application as much as you'd like. They still wouldn't be effective. So basically, my takeaway is delegated login scenarios are pretty complicated because first of all, you need to figure out how the user actually ends up logging in. And secondly, there's a lot of setup necessary. If and when possible, you should always prefer service principal scenarios. They can be fully automated and there's a lot less setup necessary for those. Would the app method allow to go past multi-factor authentication? Absolutely. Because the login is interactive, because in order to generate the access token to begin with, a user basically needs to be able to interact with the browser. Whatever login system you've got set up in your tenant applies, right? Again, service principal is a much neater way of getting to an access token as long as that's applicable in your scenario, because there's definitely no multi-factor authentication possible there. Any other questions?
I think that's it. Mathias, that was fantastic. I think those are super valuable look into the Power BI REST API, really well presented. You clearly have a passion for this automation, as you said, and also a passion for sharing your knowledge with us, and we really appreciate that. Also wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. If you have any topics that you are interested in hearing more about, please let me know. Our user group is here to serve you. And with that, I see Teresa is typing. Well, so we'll get before we oh, she's saying thank you. So we'll call it at that, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Great pleasure.
Thank you, Mathias.